Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I'm continuing in this series of the 6 acts of the shame cycle as presented by Martha Sweezy in Internal Family Systems Therapy for Shame and Guilt. And we're illustrating it with her client, Darika. And we started with Act 3 and got to know Darika's inner critic. Then we went to Act 4 and we got to know her anticipation team, the monk and the nuns. And we went to Act 5 in the last video with her warrior part that acted out in rage to protect her more vulnerable parts from her boyfriend. And now we are going to go to Act 6, which is the Feel Better Rescue Team. This is another set of firefighters that can come out in this whole cycle of shame that happens. So Darika's 6th act involved a reactive protector binging on sweets, which motivated another part to manage the risk of weight gain by restricting her food intake. Okay, so this is a whole cluster of parts around food where the binging firefighter is trying to help her feel better, to numb the pain. But then another manager, this restrictor part, comes in and says, no, that's shameful, that's terrible, we can't do that. So now they're in a tug of war. So now in the session with Martha, Darika says, I'm terrified of being fat and getting diabetes like my grandmother, but I can't seem to stop eating sweets. I wake up thinking about what hour I can have something sweet. I don't eat anything except black coffee before noon. I have to do that because I'd start the day off with kheer if I let myself. My grandmother made the best kheer, this milk pudding I could eat all day long. So again, she's describing here this binging part that likes sweets, and then the part that makes her eat nothing but drink black coffee until noon to try to balance it out. So the therapist says, you have parts who get comfort from kheer. So she's kind of just reflecting back. And Darika says, some days I don't eat a meal at all. I just gobble sweet things like kheer and dates and raisins and chocolate. I have a part who says that all that is natural, so it's good for me. But really it's sugar, isn't it? It makes me feel tired. So again, the part that wants to restrict is kind of giving its, you can hear the parts kind of going back and forth there. And Martha says, so some parts get comfort from eating the sweets, but the body feels tired and then other parts worry. What would you feel if you didn't eat the sweets? So Martha here is naming the parts that she's hearing Darika talk about. And then she's basically asking that part that craves the sweets, what would happen if you didn't eat the sweets? And Darika says, I don't know. And the therapist says, is it okay to imagine not eating a sweet and then see what happens? This is a really good exercise. It's like, okay, because sometimes in the moment you can feel it. Like if the restricting part is making you not eat the sweet, you can feel the tension in your body, right? You could feel what happens. So she's having her imagine that. And Darika says, okay. And then she has a long pause and she's trying to imagine. And she says, anxiety is building. And the therapist says, and then what? Darika says, I want to stop it. Stop the anxiety, right? The therapist says, but what if you could help the anxious part? Darika nods. Would it like to have help? Darika nods again. So ask the anxious part if it protects anyone else. Darika says, yes, an anxious part. And the therapist says, so you have an anxious part who protects an anxious part. This is very common. A lot of parts are afraid of anxious parts. So there's like a whole spiral, a whole layering of anxious parts. And the therapist, because she's been working with Darika and knows some of her parts, says, is this the gerbil and the little girl? And Darika asks inside and then nods, yes. And the therapist says, so who needs help first? Darika says, the little girl. Therapist asks, where do you find her? Darika says, she's turning away so I won't look at her. She's about 4. The therapist says, is she aware of you? Darika says, yes. And the therapist says, does she know who you are? Darika says, no. Therapist says, would she like to meet you? Darika says, yes, but she doesn't want me to come any closer. And the therapist says, she's the boss. I love this phrase that I hear Dick Schwartz say a lot. Our parts are always the boss, meaning the self never tramples the boundaries, the desires of the parts. So she says, she's the boss, and Darika says, she likes that. And the therapist says, how do you feel toward her? And Darika says, I would like to know more about her. This is an indication that Darika is in self. So you can see a couple things in this example. One is this binging part, which is part of Act 6, the Feel Better Rescue Team, right? It's trying to actually help this young exile not feel so bad. It's trying to soothe the exile. So it has really good intention. So when the therapist asks, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't binge? It reveals the anxious parts underneath. That's what it's trying to avoid. That's what it's trying to protect. So that question points to what's being protected underneath. And then as Darika is going toward this child part that's anxious, Martha asks the question, how do you feel toward her? Because that's assessing for self-energy. There's been many times in the past where she'll ask, and Darika is blended with parts, right? That are allied or dislike or embarrassed, all those kinds of things. But in this case, Darika seems to be in self because she said, I would like to know more about her. And she's very respectful of her boundaries. So then Martha says, as we have discovered over time, Darika's anxious 4-year-old was in exile, a part who longed for more time with her parents, who got great comfort from her grandmother, but was acutely aware of her grandmother's lack of power and confidence in the foreign world of the United States. Unlike her cheerful older brother, who seemed to gobble life up, this little girl felt needy, burdensome, and afraid. Okay, so in the process now, after going through all of these different protective parts, they've honed in on this exile who is holding these beliefs of I'm needy, I'm burdensome, and this anxiety that she's feeling. So in the next video, we're going to come full circle because, like I said, these acts 3 through 6 are usually what presents first, all the protective measures that the parts take to protect the wound underneath, which is this 4-year-old girl, and other parts, as we'll see. So then we end up coming to acts 1 and 2, the injury of what happened and the ownership, the acceptance of that part that I am bad or I am unlovable. So in the next video, we'll talk about how that went for Darika.